What's the difference between the traumas that happen to us and the generational trauma that happened to our ancestors?
So the major difference is placed in biology. So there's a genetic component to intergenerational trauma. And so intergenerational trauma has this way in which there is a genetic transmission that happens from parent to child.
Really?
And so it creates a predisposition to vulnerability to stress.
Give me an example. What's a common example you see in your practice that is a generational story?
Well, I mean, there are people that will come in and say, ever since I was a child, it was like difficult to soothe. And I was, I had like this hyperactivity. There's a lot of trauma survivors that also like believe that their symptoms coincide with ADHD because there's a lot of overlap in the experience in the symptomatology. So there's a lot of that. There's like people that reflect back to their childhood and they say like I've always had like this experience that felt like I was always anxious. When we dig into the layers and we dig deep, we start noticing, okay, especially because I do a lot of like family tree work and like really going down the lineage to know like, well, what are some of the trauma responses or what are some of the responses around also like inflammatory responses like depression or anxiety or other kind of like mental illness, experiences that were held in the family. And when we start going down the family line and we start exploring not only their childhood and how they responded in their childhood, what their attachment patterns were in their childhood, but also how perhaps like their mother had an inner child wound and their mother's mother had an inner child wound.
And they never healed it.
Never healed it, expressed it as a trauma response, yelled and screamed in the home, had like emotional outbursts. What did that do? That actually created a disruption in the attachment that you could have had like in your childhood. It created an insecure attachment. You then went out into the world and experienced bullying, a pandemic, like all kinds of things. And then that trauma, propensity or vulnerability got triggered out. And so now you are continuing the cycle of intergenerational trauma because it was modeled to you genetically, it was passed down, and then,
Now, is it genetic or is it, let's say the mother breaks the cycle before she heals her trauma, the generational trauma, before she has her child?
She can.
And she creates an environment of peace,
Yeah.
Is it the environment or is it the biology, the genetic code that is passed down? Because it's like these environments are kind of passed down. You witness your parents doing it, you just follow the pattern and you follow the environment pattern.
Yeah.
Is that genetic? Is that environment? What is both? Or?
It's both. It's like, for as long as psychology has existed, we've had like theories on nature, nurture. Darwinism also kind of just started that, right? Like way back when. So nature being like the biological aspects of our experiences and then nurture being like the social aspects of our experiences. And intergenerational trauma is really the only trauma that is situated at the intersection of both. So we have the nature side. Yeah, so, on the nature side, the genetic expression, like we're getting a lot of information from like the field of epigenetics, which helps us understand how behavior like impacts genes. And so basically what happens is that, let's say a mother has stress and depression in her life. Let's say that this mother is actually pregnant at 5 months gestation. So she's pregnant, she has a baby in utero. And because she's at 5 months gestation, that baby also has all the precursor sex cells that they're gonna have for their lifetime, regardless of whether it's male or female. They already have those. So the mother, she experienced chronic trauma her entire life. And so because that became the status quo, her genes re-expressed. So her genes said, okay, this is the way that things are. We are a stressed body. And so because her genes are now saying we are predisposed to stress, that's being handed down to the baby in utero, actually at conception.
Wow.
So the baby is conceived into genes that are predisposed to stress. And because she is already still stressed while she's having this baby, all those stress hormones, namely cortisol, those are being passed down to the baby in utero. And what's happening to the precursor cells? Those are also ingesting a lot of that stress environment. So you have 3 generations in one body.
Wow.
Genetically being passed down the stress vulnerability But also the social piece, the mother's stress, like she has all her things going on. She's predisposed to trauma. She's got all these things going while she's,
Right.
Still
Her
pregnant.
environment is still stressful, yeah.
Yeah. And so everybody
Wow.
in that lineage of 3 generations in one body is experiencing stress.
Is it just 3 generations, or is it like every generation that's had it?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg kind of phenomenon when it comes to intergenerational trauma, right? Like it's like who started it, right? But I think I illustrate that because it's, I think, a little bit easier to see, like, oh, well, maybe it started with mom. Maybe she was, the person that...
Maybe she had an extreme trauma and there was a reaction
Yeah,
response. Yeah,
exactly, right? And so
That's what
now
you're
we
saying.
at least get to see where the genetic line started
Yeah.
from the trauma perspective.
When you think about it that way, you're like, man, I'm carrying the weight of, multiple generations of trauma in my genes, like physical weight, actual weight.
Yeah.
That could get a little dark and heavy if you really put the emphasis on that. So how do we actually break that cycle once and for all, where none of that trauma stays with us and we don't pass it down to our kids?
It definitely has to be a very whole system overhaul for most folks. Like it has to be, an integration of holistic practices in our day-to-day
Daily.
lives every single day.
Like a daily practice.
Every day. Can't waver on it because we got to think about what we're undoing. We're not just undoing the decades of trauma that
you experience, yeah.
You're undoing all the...
You really need to have a rebirth.
Yeah.
It's like a spiritual, psychological, emotional, nervous system rebirth, in my opinion. I feel like I've had a couple of them in the last decade. 10 years ago, kind of opening up about my sexual abuse trauma. And then in the last few years, just dealing with all relationships in general, like all intimate relationships that I've had. I've never really faced them until a couple of years ago. And I feel like I had to emotionally, spiritually die in a sense.
Yeah.
Psychologically, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Allow it to burn and then build from the ashes kind of psychologically. And it's a process. I'm not saying I've finished it or whatever, but it's like a constant journey of going back to the different stages of childhood, healing each stage and integrating that age with my current self. So there's full integration and healing of every different memory from my life that was a traumatic response.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's been a beautiful journey that has allowed me to have peace and harmony on the inside, which I never had that until really 10 years ago. I didn't start feeling it, but until a couple years ago when I started feeling more and more peace on the inside. And it allows me to, again, see the world differently. I'm not saying I'm like not triggered by things, but it allows me to see it and say, okay, this sucks. How can I consciously communicate what I want to change? Not from a reactive, overwhelmed, stressed, traumatic state, which I feel like you can't really get much done from that state.
No, you can push things down and numb and still operate, fairly well, but
you can
all
survive.
All of that will come back because you're in survival mode still, because numbing is still survival mode.
But you're not thriving. You're not creating an abundant life for yourself when you're in a traumatic response, are we?
No, not at all. I mean, I think, abundance comes from being able to get into the depths of your soul, right? So I love that you're talking about the more like psycho-spiritual angle, because that is definitely, I operate from a holistic angle. And so like a lot of the work that I do is very mind, body, spirit. And the spiritual piece is really essential because it's not, just your connection to higher power. It's really just also your connection to yourself. When you're like really disconnected from your true authentic self, you're not living abundantly.
Yes.
And if we want generational abundance, then we have to get into the depths of everything that's there, into the mud, if you may.
Yeah, and I think if you're triggered or have a nervous system response to a lot of things, you're constantly in a survival mode, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to create it's hard to dream from a place of survival. It's hard to create something beautiful from that place.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense, even like, from a biological perspective. Like when we're in a nervous system response, and that's, survival mode, you're in a chronic nervous system overhaul, right? So our nervous system is designed to actually make it so that whenever we are in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, any non-essential functions, any non-essential like organ functions, bodily functions, our brain, even like the cortical region of our brain, all of that is mildly shut down. So if you're talking about like alchemizing and creativity and like all these things, those things require a lot of cortical, structure,
So
like
interesting.
manifestation of like, all the things that you want, like really requires for you to get into your creative mind. And if your cortical brain is not fully functioning in the ways that because it's in survival mode, then you're not really going to get
You're not
into that
creative.
actualization. I like the idea of challenging thoughts, right? But the thing about challenging thoughts is that the first step is that we have to write down the limiting thoughts that have been there, right? We have to write down the emotions that have been associated with those limiting thoughts. And then we have to challenge those thoughts.